The moment they believed fear gave them control was the moment everything started slipping out of their hands, even if they didn't know it yet. It always starts the same way. Raised voices. Weapons shown just enough to make the message clear. A belief that panic is contagious, and once it spreads, no one thinks straight anymore. They counted on that. They needed fear to do the work for them because they didn't have the skill, the patience, or the discipline to hold real power. They thought fear was leverage, that if they created enough chaos, people would freeze, that authority would bend, that trained professionals would suddenly become desperate men willing to bargain away standards just to stop the tension. That's the fantasy cowards cling to. Fear feels powerful when you're the one causing it. It creates the illusion that you're in charge, that the room belongs to you, that every second ticking by is another second of dominance. But fear doesn't affect everyone the same way. For some people, fear sharpens focus. It strips away noise. It turns panic into process. And when you're dealing with people who have trained their entire lives to function inside fear, your greatest weapon becomes your biggest mistake. The hostage takers didn't understand that. They mistook silence for hesitation. They mistook calm for weakness. They mistook restraint for uncertainty. They watched the clock and assumed it was on their side. Fear makes untrained people rush. It makes them overreact. It makes them say too much, move too fast, show their hand. The hostage takers leaned into that. They threatened because they believed threats were control. They escalated because escalation felt like momentum. Every raised voice, every reckless move convinced them they were tightening their grip, when in reality they were mapping themselves out piece by piece. What they didn't see was the shift happening outside the room. The quiet kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself. No shouting. No dramatic gestures. Just decisions being made with precision. Fear wasn't spreading the way they expected. It was being contained, analyzed, neutralized. The more chaos they created, the clearer the picture became for the people watching them. Fear has a shelf life. At first, it shocks. Then it informs. Then it loses value. Once everyone understands how far you're willing to go, fear stops being a threat and becomes a known variable. And known variables are manageable. The hostage takers kept pushing, thinking intensity would reset the balance. Instead, it confirmed exactly who they were dealing with and how this would end. They believed fear would make them unpredictable. It did the opposite. Every aggressive move followed the same pattern. Every threat revealed motive. Every mistake narrowed options. Fear didn't make them powerful. It made them transparent. And transparency is dangerous when your opponents are trained to exploit patterns under pressure. The woman they took hostage was never just a bargaining chip. She was the reason fear stopped working. Because once you cross that line, you don't control the situation anymore. You define it. And the definition becomes simple. There's no room for half measures. No room for compromise disguised as mercy. The presence of a hostage doesn't force negotiations. It forces clarity. Fear relies on the belief that the other side values comfort more than principle, that they'll trade long-term consequences for short-term relief, that they'll choose the easy out if it's painful enough to wait. But when the people responding have already accepted risk as part of their job, fear loses its currency. It can't buy hesitation. It can't buy mercy. It can't buy time. The hostage takers kept acting like fear was an asset they could spend again and again. They didn't realize they'd already spent it all in the first moments. After that, every second was just documentation. Every move was being measured against training, not emotion. Fear was no longer driving the situation. It was just noise in the background while decisions were finalized and roles were assigned, and angles were calculated and timing was refined, and the people inside the room continued believing they were still in control. Why hostage takers always underestimate resolve has nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with projection. They assume everyone thinks the way they do. They assume fear works because fear works on them. They assume pressure breaks people because pressure would break them. So they build their entire plan around a fragile idea that the human instinct for self-preservation will override everything else. Resolve doesn't look dramatic from the outside. That's the first mistake. It's quiet. It doesn't argue. It doesn't posture. It doesn't rush to prove itself. People with resolve don't announce it because they don't need validation. They don't negotiate with their own fear, so they don't need to convince anyone else. To someone looking for cracks, that calm reads like uncertainty. To someone who has never been trained to endure pressure, composure feels fake, temporary, something that will collapse if pushed hard enough. So the pushing begins. More threats, more deadlines, louder voices. A belief that if the situation feels unbearable, the other side will fold. Hostage takers escalate because they think resolve is a bluff. They believe everyone has a breaking point they can reach if they just apply enough force. What they don't understand is that resolve isn't about resisting pressure. It's about having already decided what matters before the pressure arrives. People with resolve don't wait to choose under stress. The choice is made long before the moment comes. That's what training does. That's what discipline does. It removes the debate. When the decision is settled, fear doesn't have anything to negotiate with. There's no internal argument to exploit, no hesitation to amplify. The hostage takers keep searching for reactions that never come, convinced the absence of panic means progress. They underestimate resolve because they think emotion drives action. They think anger, desperation, or empathy will override structure. They expect pleading. They expect bargaining. They expect visible struggle. When they don't get it, they assume it's an act. They assume the other side will eventually crack because that's how their own resolve would fail. What they miss is that real resolve often looks indifferent to intimidation. Not because it doesn't care, but because it understands the cost of caring too much about threats. Resolve doesn't deny danger. It acknowledges it and moves forward anyway. That's a concept people who rely on fear rarely grasp. Fear is their strategy because fear is their limit. They've never had to function without it. Hostage takers also underestimate resolve because they believe time is a weapon. They think waiting creates fatigue. That nerves will fray. That patience will erode. They don't realize patience is often the strongest indicator of resolve. The ability to wait without forcing an outcome is not weakness. It's confidence. It means the plan doesn't depend on luck or emotional reactions. It means there's no rush because the outcome is already accepted. Every hour that passes without concessions convinces them something is wrong. They start making mistakes. They overplay their hand. They repeat threats that no longer shock. They begin arguing with themselves. Resolve doesn't need to respond to any of it. Silence becomes pressure. Stillness becomes control. The very thing they relied on starts turning against them. They also misunderstand compassion. They think caring makes people soft, that empathy creates openings they can exploit. They don't understand that compassion paired with resolve is immovable. It doesn't cave. It doesn't abandon principles to relieve discomfort. It doesn't trade long-term consequences for temporary relief. Resolve allows compassion without surrender. The hostage takers keep expecting resolve to look like defiance. They want resistance they can push against. They want anger they can provoke. What they get instead is consistency. The same posture, the same boundaries, the same refusal to be rushed or rattled. Resolve doesn't fluctuate. It doesn't spike. It doesn't dip. That stability is unsettling to people who thrive on chaos. They underestimate resolve because they think power comes from control over others. They don't see that the most dangerous kind of power is control over oneself. When fear doesn't dictate actions, intimidation loses purpose. When resolve removes the need for negotiation, leverage disappears. The hostage takers keep trying to force a reaction, unaware that the absence of reaction is the signal that the situation has already moved beyond their influence and into a phase where resolve is no longer being tested, but quietly exercised as plans continue forming without them realizing how much ground they've already lost while believing the standoff is still unfolding in their favor. The difference between criminals and professionals shows up long before anyone speaks. Criminals rely on impulse. Professionals rely on preparation. One group reacts to pressure. The other expects it. Criminals move fast because they're nervous. Professionals move deliberately because they're certain. That contrast defines everything that follows, especially when lives are on the line. Criminals mistake aggression for strength. They think loud voices and sudden movements create authority. They believe dominance comes from intimidation and that control can be taken by force alone. Professionals know authority comes from discipline. They don't need to announce power because it's already built into how they operate. Their confidence doesn't spike or collapse depending on the moment. It stays level because it's grounded in training, not emotion. Criminals plan just enough to get started. Professionals plan for what happens when the plan fails. That's one of the biggest gaps between them. Criminals assume things will go their way if they're bold enough. Professionals assume something will go wrong and prepare accordingly. When pressure hits, criminals improvise emotionally. Professionals execute adjustments they've already rehearsed. Criminals talk too much. They threaten. They explain. They justify. They reveal pieces of themselves with every word because they're trying to maintain the illusion of control. Professionals communicate with precision. Few words. Clear intent. No wasted energy. Silence isn't discomfort to them. It's a tool. They understand that information is leverage, and the less you give away, the stronger your position remains. Criminals rely on fear because it's easy. Fear doesn't require skill. It just requires willingness to cross lines. Professionals rely on competence. They don't need fear to move people because they're not trying to provoke reactions. They're trying to manage outcomes. Fear creates chaos, and chaos is unpredictable. Professionals reduce chaos. They don't thrive in disorder. They eliminate it. Criminals focus on the immediate moment. Professionals see the entire sequence. Criminals fixate on what's happening right now, what they're feeling right now, what they want right now. Professionals think in timelines. They consider how one decision affects the next 5 minutes, the next hour, the next day. That long view allows them to absorb stress without panicking because they're not trapped in the urgency of the present moment. Criminals personalize conflict. They take things as challenges to their ego. Any resistance feels like disrespect. Any delay feels like defiance. Professionals don't take it personally. Emotion doesn't drive their actions. The situation isn't about proving anything. It's about resolving it. That emotional distance allows them to stay objective even when the stakes are high. Criminals look for shortcuts. Professionals trust process. Criminals want fast wins because they don't believe they can sustain control for long. Professionals are patient because they're built for endurance. They don't rush decisions to relieve tension. They're comfortable sitting in it. Time doesn't scare them because time is part of the plan. Criminals operate in isolation even when they're in groups. Everyone is protecting themselves. Trust is thin. Loyalty is temporary. Professionals operate as a unit. Roles are defined. Responsibilities are clear. Everyone knows where they fit and what's expected. That cohesion doesn't come from charisma. It comes from repetition and shared standards. Criminals confuse unpredictability with advantage. They think being erratic makes them harder to counter. In reality, it makes them easier to read. Patterns emerge quickly when actions are driven by emotion. Professionals value consistency. Their predictability to each other is what makes them effective. To outsiders, that consistency looks calm. To criminals, it looks like hesitation. Criminals are reactive. Professionals are intentional. Criminals wait for something to happen, then respond. Professionals decide what needs to happen and move toward it. That difference changes who controls the tempo. Control of tempo is control of the situation. The side that dictates pace dictates outcomes. Criminals believe power is taken. Professionals know power is maintained. Taken power is unstable. It has to be constantly defended. Maintained power is quiet. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't need reinforcement through threats. It exists because it's supported by capability and restraint. Criminals think survival means winning the moment. Professionals understand survival means managing risk. They don't gamble with lives to feel dominant. They calculate. They measure. They accept danger without being reckless. That balance between aggression and control is something criminals never master because it requires humility, patience, and respect for consequence. Criminals operate on hope. Hope that fear will work. Hope that no one calls their bluff. Hope that things won't escalate beyond their control. Professionals operate on certainty. Not certainty of comfort or safety, but certainty of response. They know what they'll do under pressure because they've already done it countless times in training and preparation, and the gap between criminals and professionals becomes painfully clear the moment chaos stops working and only competence remains relevant, while one side keeps grasping for control it never truly had, and the other continues moving forward with calm precision grounded in discipline and experience rather than impulse or desperation. How discipline replaces negotiation begins with the understanding that not every situation is meant to be talked through. Negotiation assumes both sides are operating in good faith, that each party is willing to compromise, that the goal is mutual resolution. Discipline doesn't assume any of that. Discipline assumes responsibility. It assumes obligation. It assumes that certain lines, once crossed, remove the option to bargain. Negotiation is reactive by nature. It responds to demands. Discipline is proactive. It's built long before the moment arrives. When discipline is present, the decision-making framework is already in place. There's no debate about what should be done. No weighing of emotions. No scrambling to figure out the next move. Discipline turns chaos into a sequence of actions guided by standards rather than circumstance. Those who rely on negotiation often believe flexibility is strength. They think adaptability means bending under pressure. Discipline understands that flexibility without structure becomes weakness. Structure creates boundaries. Boundaries remove ambiguity. When ambiguity is gone, negotiation loses relevance. There's nothing to discuss because the response has already been defined by training, values, and rules of engagement. Discipline also removes ego from the equation. Negotiation can become personal. It invites posturing, persuasion, manipulation. Each side tries to extract advantage through words. Discipline doesn't argue. It doesn't persuade. It doesn't threaten. It executes. That execution isn't emotional. It's procedural. It follows a system designed to function even when emotions are high and information is incomplete. People who expect negotiation often mistake discipline for coldness. They interpret silence as indifference. They assume lack of dialogue means lack of concern. In reality, discipline is what allows concern to exist without interference. It prevents panic from dictating action. It prevents sympathy from overriding responsibility. It ensures that care for life doesn't become an excuse for paralysis. Negotiation depends on uncertainty. Each side probes for limits. Discipline eliminates that probing. Limits are clear. Responses are consistent. When discipline replaces negotiation, it sends a message without words. It says this situation is no longer fluid. The rules are fixed. The outcome will follow those rules regardless of intimidation or appeal. Discipline also redistributes power. Negotiation gives power to the loudest voice, the most emotional plea, the most extreme threat. Discipline gives power to preparation. It rewards those who invested time, effort, and restraint before the moment of crisis. That power isn't visible at first. It doesn't announce itself. It simply manifests when pressure hits and the disciplined side doesn't flinch. Those relying on negotiation often believe time is their ally. They think prolonging the situation increases their leverage. Discipline turns time into a neutral factor. Waiting doesn't create urgency because urgency has already been accounted for. The disciplined side doesn't rush to end discomfort. They're comfortable letting time pass because time doesn't change their standards. Discipline also narrows options in a way negotiation never does. Negotiation keeps doors open. Discipline closes them deliberately. Each closed door reduces complexity. Reduced complexity increases control. Control isn't about dominance. It's about predictability. When actions follow a disciplined framework, outcomes become more predictable, even in volatile situations. There's also a moral clarity in discipline that negotiation can blur. Negotiation often frames everything as a trade. One thing for another. Discipline recognizes that some actions carry consequences that cannot be traded away. It draws a line between understanding and acceptance. Understanding why someone acts doesn't mean accommodating the act. Discipline allows empathy without surrender. Those who expect negotiation often escalate when they don't get it. They raise the stakes, thinking higher risk will force conversation. Discipline absorbs escalation without reacting emotionally. It doesn't mirror aggression. It doesn't need to. Escalation only confirms the necessity of the disciplined response. Each aggressive move reinforces the original assessment rather than changing it. Discipline also protects the people tasked with acting. It removes the burden of improvisation under stress. When negotiation fails, unprepared actors hesitate. Discipline eliminates hesitation. Everyone knows their role. Everyone knows the sequence. That clarity reduces mistakes and prevents emotional overreach. In environments shaped by discipline, negotiation is a last resort, not a default. It's used only when it serves the mission, not when it serves the opponent. When discipline replaces negotiation, it's not because dialogue is impossible, but because dialogue would undermine the very principles that keep people safe. Discipline isn't rigidity. It's commitment. Commitment to standards that don't bend under threat. Commitment to actions that have been tested under pressure. Commitment to outcomes defined by responsibility rather than fear. And once that commitment is visible, negotiation stops being an option because the situation has moved into a space where words no longer change anything, and only disciplined action remains relevant. What real courage looks like under pressure is rarely what people expect. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't rush forward just to prove something. Real courage is controlled. It shows up as steadiness when everything around it is unstable. It's the ability to stay present without being consumed by fear, to act deliberately when instinct is screaming to react. Most people think courage is about fearlessness. It isn't. Fear is always there. Courage is what happens when fear no longer decides. Under pressure, fear narrows vision. It speeds up thoughts. It pushes people toward extremes. Real courage slows things down. It widens perspective. It keeps judgment intact when adrenaline is trying to hijack it. Under pressure, weak courage looks like impulse. Strong courage looks like restraint. Anyone can lash out. Anyone can escalate. Anyone can make noise. It takes courage to hold position when emotions are high and consequences are heavy. It takes courage to absorb tension without discharging it recklessly. That kind of control doesn't come from confidence alone. It comes from preparation and acceptance. Real courage also means accepting responsibility for outcomes, not just the good ones. Under pressure, it's tempting to shift blame, to justify decisions, to protect ego. Courage doesn't hide behind excuses. It doesn't look for someone else to carry the weight. It accepts that action or inaction both carry consequences and chooses deliberately instead of defensively. There's also a quiet honesty in real courage. It doesn't pretend the situation is easier than it is. It doesn't sugarcoat risk. It doesn't rely on optimism to feel strong. It acknowledges danger clearly and proceeds anyway. That clarity is stabilizing. It prevents panic because there's no illusion to protect. Everything is already on the table. Real courage under pressure often looks boring to outsiders. There's no drama in it. No theatrics. Just repetition of fundamentals. Breathing controlled. Movements precise. Communication minimal and clear. Courage expresses itself through discipline when pressure peaks. The ability to do simple things correctly when everything is screaming for complexity is a form of bravery most people never recognize. It also shows up as patience. Pressure creates urgency, and urgency demands immediate resolution. Courage resists that demand when rushing would cause harm. Waiting while others panic takes strength. Holding space while uncertainty lingers takes resolve. Patience under pressure isn't passivity. It's trust in process over impulse. Real courage doesn't seek recognition. Under pressure, the bravest actions often go unnoticed because they don't draw attention. They prevent disasters that never happen. They stabilize situations before chaos spreads. That kind of courage doesn't need witnesses. It's driven by duty, not applause. There's also a moral component to courage that pressure exposes. It's easy to claim values when nothing is at stake. Under pressure, values become inconvenient. They slow things down. They limit options. Real courage holds to them anyway. It refuses shortcuts that compromise integrity, even when compromise would offer relief. Courage under pressure also includes knowing when not to act. Action feels powerful. Restraint feels risky. But sometimes the bravest choice is to wait, to observe, to gather information, to allow clarity to emerge. That kind of courage goes against instinct. It requires trust and judgment over emotion. Real courage doesn't isolate itself. It relies on others. Under pressure, ego tells people to take everything on alone. Courage recognizes interdependence. It communicates clearly. It listens. It trusts the system instead of trying to dominate it. That trust doesn't weaken resolve. It strengthens it. Pressure reveals whether courage is performative or real. Performative courage collapses when conditions change. Real courage adapts without losing direction. It's flexible without being reactive, firm without being brittle. It holds shape even when squeezed. At its core, real courage under pressure is about alignment. Thoughts, actions, and values moving together instead of fighting each other. There's no internal debate playing out in real time. The decision has already been made long before pressure arrived. That's why it looks calm. That's why it feels steady. That's why it endures while louder forms of bravery burn out quickly, leaving only noise and regret behind, as those who lack true courage struggle to understand how quiet strength carried the moment without ever needing to announce itself. The lesson cowards learn when consequences arrive is never the one they expected to learn. Cowards believe consequences are negotiable. They think there's always a way out, always a loophole, always someone else who will absorb the cost. They build their confidence on the assumption that fear shields them, that intimidation creates immunity, that crossing lines makes people back down instead of step forward. Cowards mistake avoidance for intelligence. They believe staying just ahead of accountability means they're winning. Every threat they make, every line they cross reinforces that belief. Nothing happens immediately, so they assume nothing will. That delay becomes proof, in their minds, that the world works the way they want it to. They confuse patience with weakness and silence with surrender. Consequences don't announce themselves. That's the part cowards never anticipate. There's no warning shot, no dramatic shift in tone, just a quiet narrowing of options. Doors they assumed were open stop responding. Leverage they thought they had disappears. The room feels smaller. Time starts working against them instead of for them. Cowards also believe consequences are emotional. They expect anger, retaliation fueled by impulse, reactions they can predict or provoke. Real consequences aren't emotional. They're procedural. They're the result of systems designed to function without outrage. When those systems engage, there's no arguing with them, no pleading, no reframing the story to regain control. One of the hardest lessons for cowards is realizing their behavior didn't make them unpredictable. It made them easy to understand. Patterns form quickly when actions are driven by fear and ego. Every bluff looks like the last one. Every escalation follows the same arc. By the time consequences arrive, the outcome has already been mapped. Cowards think consequences are about punishment. They're not. They're about correction. They exist to restore balance, not to satisfy emotion. That's why they feel so cold. There's no sense of victory in them. No satisfaction to exploit. Just finality. Cowards expect a reaction they can feed off. Instead, they're met with indifference. Another lesson is the realization that fear doesn't transfer. Cowards assume that because they're afraid of consequences, everyone else must be too. They don't understand that some people accept consequences as part of their responsibility. When those people act, hesitation isn't part of the equation. The cost has already been accounted for. Cowards also learn that power borrowed from fear expires quickly. It requires constant reinforcement, constant threats, constant escalation. The moment that effort stops, the power evaporates. Consequences don't require maintenance. They don't need reminders. Once they arrive, they hold without effort. There's also a lesson in isolation. Cowards believe others will step in to save them. That someone will intervene. That someone will soften the blow. When consequences arrive, that crowd disappears. Fear-driven loyalty is thin. No one wants to stand next to accountability. Cowards find themselves alone with the situation they created. They also learn that intentions don't matter. Cowards love to explain themselves after the fact. They talk about pressure, desperation, misunderstanding. Consequences don't care. They respond to actions, not explanations. The story cowards tell themselves collapses under the weight of what actually happened. Time plays a role in this lesson too. Cowards believe consequences are immediate or avoidable. They don't expect them to arrive calmly, deliberately, long after they assumed the danger had passed. That delayed arrival is part of the lesson. It teaches that nothing is forgotten just because it wasn't addressed right away. Perhaps the most painful lesson is the realization that strength was never the problem. Cowards had chances to stop, chances to step back, chances to choose differently. They didn't lack opportunity. They lacked character. Consequences expose that gap with brutal clarity. When consequences arrive, there's no room left for performance, no audience to impress, no narrative to control, just the reality of choices meeting outcomes. Cowards finally understand that fear doesn't protect you from accountability. It attracts it. That intimidation doesn't erase standards. It triggers them. That crossing lines doesn't move the line. It confirms where it is. And in that moment, when consequences stop being theoretical and start being unavoidable, cowards don't suddenly become brave. They become small. The noise fades. The threats stop. The confidence drains away. What's left is the understanding they spent so much effort avoiding. That real power was never about forcing others to be afraid, but about having the courage to live within limits, accept responsibility, and face outcomes without hiding. Something they realize too late as the weight of consequence settles in and the illusion they lived inside finally collapses around them without resistance or negotiation or escape.